Sometimes, the most dangerous predator is the one everyone underestimates. The ADX Florence Supermax prison sits like a concrete tomb against the Colorado Rockies, designed to hold America's most dangerous criminals in permanent isolation for 3 years. Miguel Santander had been the invisible man, the quiet accountant who once tracked millions in cartel money, now tracking every detail of prison life with the same obsessive precision. When 4 inmates cornered him in the shower block on a February morning, shanks gleaming under fluorescent lights, they saw only the bookkeeper who testified against their bosses. They didn't see the man who had memorized every guard schedule, every blind spot, every weakness in their fortress. What they couldn't have seen was the ancient burial ground beneath the prison, or the restless spirits that Miguel's Mayan grandmother had taught him to recognize in childhood dreams. As Miguel lay bleeding, something stirred in the foundations below, something that remembered when justice was swift, brutal, and absolute. Within 48 hours, his attackers began dying in ways that defied explanation, and the prison descended into chaos. But was Miguel orchestrating an impossible revenge, or had he awakened something far older and more terrible than any cartel enforcer? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The screaming started at 3:47 a.m. Marcus jerked awake in his narrow bunk, the concrete walls of ADX Florence seeming to pulse with the raw, animalistic sounds echoing through the corridors. 12 years of imprisonment had trained his body to wake instantly at any disturbance. Survival depended on knowing when violence was coming, even if you couldn't escape it. But this wasn't the usual nighttime chaos. The screams carried a different quality, desperate and foreign, punctuated by rapid-fire Spanish that made Marcus's blood run cold. He recognized the voice, Chapo. Marcus rolled silently from his bunk and pressed his ear to the steel door of his cell. Through the narrow food slot, he could see the faint glow of emergency lighting painting everything in sickly yellow. Guard boots thundered past his door, their urgent rhythm confirming what his gut already knew. Someone had made a move. The screaming stopped abruptly. In the suffocating silence that followed, Marcus closed his eyes and let his breathing slow. He'd spent 3 decades hunting men like Guzman through the jungles of Colombia and the mountains of Mexico, back when he still believed in badges and justice. Now they were neighbors in this federal tomb, separated by 10 feet of concrete and a lifetime of choices that had led them both to the same dark place. The irony wasn't lost on him. Ghost Delgado, the DEA legend who'd brought down the Medellin cartel's money laundering operation, sharing breathing space with El Chapo, the man who'd inherited their empire. If his former colleagues could see him now, they might appreciate the poetic justice. If they knew the truth about why he was really here, they'd understand why poetry had nothing to do with it. Footsteps approached his cell. Marcus moved away from the door and sat on his bunk, assuming the posture of a man who'd been sleeping peacefully. When the slot opened, he didn't flinch. "Everything quiet in there, Delgado?" The guard's voice was tight with adrenaline. "Like a grave, Officer Martinez." Marcus kept his tone neutral, giving nothing away. He'd learned long ago that showing interest in prison drama was a luxury that could get you killed. The slot slammed shut. More footsteps, more shouted orders in the distance. Marcus waited until the corridor fell silent again, before allowing himself to consider what he'd just witnessed. 3 days ago, he'd been in the exercise yard when he'd overheard Tommy the Torch Benedetto talking to his crew. Benedetto was old-school Italian mob doing life without parole for crimes that had made headlines in the 90s. He commanded respect even in a place like ADX Florence, where respect was measured in cigarettes and silence. The conversation had been brief, coded in the careful language of men who knew every word might be recorded. But Marcus had spent enough years in the field to recognize an assassination plot when he heard one. Christmas Day, the new arrival, a gift for the guards. He should have stayed invisible. That was the rule that had kept him alive for 12 years in this concrete hell. Don't interfere. Don't take sides. Don't remind anyone that Ghost Delgado still drew breath while better men had died because of what he'd discovered about Operation Nightfall. But something about hearing Chapo's voice had stirred memories Marcus thought he'd successfully buried. the sound of helicopters over Guadalajara, the taste of dust and cordite in his mouth, the weight of evidence files that had contained enough proof to topple governments, files that had disappeared the night before his arrest. Now, lying in the darkness of his cell, Marcus realized his carefully constructed invisibility was about to shatter, because despite every instinct screaming at him to stay hidden, he'd already made his choice the moment he'd decided to listen instead of walking away. He thought about the note he'd slipped to Rodriguez during dinner service yesterday. 5 words in Spanish, passed with the casual expertise of a man who'd run covert operations in 16 countries. "They come for you Christmas." The screaming tonight meant Chapo had taken the warning seriously. It also meant Marcus had just painted a target on his own back in the most dangerous prison in America. Through the narrow window high in his cell, Marcus could see the first pale hint of dawn touching the Colorado mountains. Christmas was still 4 days away, but he knew Benedetto wouldn't wait long to make another move. Men like him didn't accept failure gracefully, especially not in a place where reputation was the only currency that mattered. Marcus ran his thumb along the scar on his left wrist, a nervous habit he'd developed during his first year inside. The scar marked the spot where they'd removed his wedding ring after sentencing, back when he'd still believed his wife might wait for him, before he'd learned that some betrayals cut deeper than any knife. In the growing light, he could see the small mirror mounted to his wall, reflecting back the face of a man who'd aged 20 years and 12. Silver hair, lined skin, eyes that had seen too much truth for their own good. But beneath the wear and resignation, something else flickered, something that had been dormant so long he'd forgotten its name: purpose. Because if saving Chapo's life meant finally learning why Ghost Delgado had been buried alive in ADX Florence, then maybe it was time to stop being invisible. The steel door's food slot opened with its familiar metallic scrape at exactly 6:30 a.m. Marcus had been awake for 3 hours, sitting on the edge of his bunk in the pre-dawn darkness, but he'd learned to time his movements to the guards' expectations. 12 years had taught him that survival meant becoming predictable in all the wrong ways, while staying invisible in all the right ones. "Breakfast, Delgado." Officer Martinez's voice carried the exhaustion of a man who'd spent the night filing incident reports. The plastic tray slid through the slot with the same institutional grace it had every morning for the past 4,380 days. Marcus approached slowly, maintaining the shuffle that had become second nature. Cold oatmeal, 2 slices of white bread, a bruised apple, and coffee that tasted like dishwater. The same meal he'd eaten yesterday and would eat tomorrow, a beige monument to the federal government's commitment to keeping dangerous men barely alive. But today the routine felt different. As he lifted the tray, Marcus caught himself scanning the corridor through the narrow slot, listening for unusual sounds, searching for signs that last night's chaos had shifted the delicate ecosystem of ADX Florence. This was dangerous thinking, the kind that had gotten good agents killed in Bogota and Juarez when they'd started believing they could predict the unpredictable. He forced himself to eat mechanically, savoring nothing, while his mind cataloged the fragments of the life he'd built in this tomb. It wasn't much, but it was his. A collection of Robert Parker novels traded from other inmates, legal documents yellowing in a manila folder, 3 photographs his sister still sent at Christmas despite his requests that she stop. The pictures showed her family aging in accelerated time, nieces and nephews growing up, her husband growing gray, all of them moving forward while Marcus remained frozen in this concrete purgatory. The photographs were contraband of a sort, not officially forbidden, but dangerous in their own way. They reminded him of what he'd lost, what he'd never had, what other men would kill for. In ADX Florence, having something to lose made you a target. Having something you loved made you weak. At 7:15, his cell door would open for 1 hour of recreation, not yard time. That was a privilege reserved for twice-weekly rotation, but an hour in the narrow corridor outside his cell, perhaps a shower if the guards felt generous, maybe conversation with Rodriguez 3 cells down if the mood was right. It was the closest thing to freedom Marcus experienced, and he'd learned to cherish these 60 minutes like a dying man savors final breaths. But first came the ritual that had sustained him through every day of his sentence, the letters he would never send. Marcus pulled out a worn composition notebook and a stubby pencil, both purchased from the commissary with money his sister deposited monthly despite his protests. He opened to a fresh page and began writing in the careful script of a man who had nothing but time. Dear Elena, today marks day 4381. I dreamed about the house in Tucson again last night, the one we looked at before everything went wrong. You said you could grow tomatoes in the backyard, maybe get a dog. I wonder if you ever think about that house, or if you've trained yourself to forget the way I've tried to forget your voice saying my name. He paused, pencil hovering over paper. The letter would go in the box with 847 others. Unsent confessions to a woman who'd remarried a tax attorney from Phoenix and probably hadn't thought about Marcus Delgado in half a decade. Writing to her was masochistic therapy, a way of bleeding out the poison of regret one word at a time. I may have made a mistake last night. There's a man here who reminds me of the choices that brought me to this place, and I did something that might have consequences. You always said I couldn't resist playing hero, even when the world didn't want saving. I think you were right. The irony cut deep. Elena had begged him to transfer to a desk job in the DEA's Phoenix office, to leave the fieldwork to younger agents who hadn't already sacrificed enough years to the war on drugs. She'd seen the signs, the paranoia, the drinking, the way he'd started talking about conspiracies that reached into the highest levels of government. She'd wanted him to choose her over the truth. He'd chosen the truth. It had destroyed them both. If something happens to me, know that I never stop loving you. Not for a single day in this place. Marcus closed the notebook and slid it under his mattress. Through his cell's narrow window, he could see snow beginning to fall on the Colorado mountains, the same pristine whiteness that had greeted him on his first morning in ADX Florence. The seasons changed, but this place remained constant, a machine designed to grind hope into dust. His cell door's electronic lock clicked open. Recreation time, Delgado. Officer Martinez's voice held a new note of suspicion. Keep it quiet out there. Marcus stood slowly, joints protesting after hours of stillness. As he stepped into the corridor, he caught sight of Rodriguez emerging from his own cell 3 doors down. The older man's eyes found his immediately, and Marcus saw something there that hadn't been present yesterday: fear. The fear in Rodriguez's eyes lasted only a moment before the older man's expression shifted back to practiced neutrality. But Marcus had seen it, that flash of recognition that meant his warning had reached the right ears, and that consequences were already spreading through the prison's invisible network like ripples from a stone thrown into dark water. "Morning, Ghost." Rodriguez's voice carried its usual gravelly indifference, but he positioned himself closer to Marcus's cell than normal, close enough for whispered conversation when the guards moved on. "Morning." Marcus kept his own voice level while his peripheral vision tracked Officer Martinez's movement down the corridor. The guard was conducting the usual head counts, but his body language suggested heightened alertness. Word about last night's incident was filtering down through the ranks, creating the kind of institutional tension that made everyone dangerous. When Martinez disappeared around the corner, Rodriguez moved closer. "Your friend had visitors last night, medical kind." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Serious?" "Serious enough. Word is someone got creative with a sharpened toothbrush during shower rotation. Missed anything vital, but sent a clear message." Rodriguez's eyes flicked toward the far end of the corridor where Chapo's cell lay hidden behind reinforced steel. "Course, that's not the interesting part." "What's the interesting part?" "Your friend talked to the warden. Not the guards, the warden. Personal visit at 4 a.m. Rodriguez's scarred face revealed nothing, but Marcus heard the weight behind his words. "When's the last time you seen the warden make house calls for attempted murder in this place?" "Never." In 12 years at ADX Florence, Marcus had seen Warden Blackwood exactly 3 times during his initial intake interview, at a mandatory prisoner orientation that had lasted 15 minutes, and briefly during a congressional inspection tour 2 years ago. Men like Blackwood didn't descend into the concrete depths of solitary confinement to comfort wounded inmates. Unless those inmates were special. "Maybe the feds want to keep their prize fish breathing," Marcus offered. But even as he said it, he knew the explanation felt thin. El Chapo was a symbol, not an asset. His value lay in his captivity, not his testimony. Maybe. Rodriguez's tone suggested he wasn't buying it either. Or maybe your friends got something they still need. The electronic lock on Marcus's cell clicked twice, the 5-minute warning that recreation time was ending. Around them, other inmates began their shuffling retreat back into their concrete boxes, the brief illusion of freedom dissolving into another day of managed isolation. But as Marcus turned toward his cell, Rodriguez caught his arm with surprising strength. "Ghost." The older man's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Benedetto's been asking questions. About you. About how you knew to warn the fish." His grip tightened. "Be careful who you try to save. Sometimes the favor gets returned whether you want it or not." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd spent 12 years flying under the radar, carefully cultivating the image of a broken agent who'd lost his edge along with his freedom. But saving Chapo had been a miscalculation. It had reminded people that Ghost Delgado still existed beneath the institutional facade. "Delgado, Rodriguez, time's up." Martinez's voice echoed from the guard station, sharp with impatience. As Marcus stepped back into his cell, the steel door sealing him in for another 23 hours, he heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the administrative wing. These weren't the heavy boots of guards or the shuffle of inmates. These were dress shoes on concrete, polished leather that didn't belong in the depths of ADX Florence. Through his food slot, Marcus watched 3 figures in dark suits walk past his cell. Federal agents, moving with the purposeful stride of men carrying fresh orders. Behind them walked Warden Blackwood himself, his expression grim as carved stone. They stopped at Chapo's cell. Marcus pressed his ear to his door, straining to catch fragments of conversation through the thick steel and concrete. The voices were muffled, but he caught enough to understand that this wasn't a routine medical check or administrative visit. Someone had made a phone call after last night's incident. Someone with enough authority to mobilize federal resources on Christmas week. When the footsteps finally retreated 20 minutes later, the corridor fell into an unnatural silence. No television sounds from neighboring cells, no conversations shouted between doors. Even the usual mechanical hums of the facility seemed muted, as if the entire prison was holding its breath. Marcus sat on his bunk and stared at the unopened letter under his mattress. Yesterday he'd been Marcus Delgado, invisible, forgotten, serving out his days in carefully managed obscurity. Today, he was Ghost again, whether he wanted to be or not. And somewhere 3 cells away, El Chapo Guzman was learning that some favors came with a price that couldn't be paid in cigarettes or silence. The choice Marcus had made in warning Chapo was already reshaping the world around him. Now he had to decide whether to retreat back into invisibility or step fully into whatever game was being played in the shadows of America's most secure prison. Either way, Christmas was still 3 days away. The silence that followed the federal agent's departure felt like the aftermath of an explosion, a ringing emptiness that pressed against Marcus's eardrums and made breathing difficult. He remained sitting on his bunk, staring at the door where those polished shoes had passed, while his mind wrestled with the implications of what he'd witnessed. 3 federal agents, on December 22nd, in the most secure prison in America. That kind of response didn't happen for a simple assault with a sharpened toothbrush. It happened when national security was at stake, when someone with clearance levels above the warden's pay grade decided that a situation required immediate federal attention. It happened when the invisible machinery of government moved to protect assets that officially didn't exist. Marcus stood and began pacing the narrow confines of his cell, 3 steps to the wall, turn, 3 steps back. It was a nervous habit he'd developed during his first year inside, when the walls had seemed to shrink daily and the weight of his sentence had threatened to crush what remained of his sanity. Now the repetitive movement helped him think, each step marking time while his mind sifted through possibilities he didn't want to consider. The smart move was obvious. Retreat. Become invisible again. Pretend the warning had been an impulse born of boredom rather than instinct. Let the situation resolve itself without further involvement. He'd survived 12 years in this place by following exactly that philosophy. Head down, mouth shut, blend into the gray concrete until even the guards forgot his name most days. But Rodriguez's words echoed in his memory. Benedetto's been asking questions. About you. That changed everything. In ADX Florence, Questions were currency, and currency was power. If Tommy the Torch Benedetto was asking questions about Ghost Delgado, it meant Marcus's carefully constructed invisibility was already compromised. The mob enforcer commanded enough respect to make inquiries dangerous for their subjects, and enough connections to get answers that most inmates couldn't access. Marcus thought about Benedetto's reputation, built on 3 decades of enforcing omerta with medieval efficiency. The man hadn't survived this long by accepting interference gracefully. If he'd planned Chapo's execution as some kind of statement, a message to the cartels, or the government, or whoever might be listening, then Marcus's intervention represented more than inconvenience. It represented disrespect. And disrespect, in a place where reputation was the only protection against predators, was a death sentence. Marcus stopped pacing and pressed his palms against the cold concrete wall. The chill seeped through his skin, but it couldn't touch the growing heat of an old familiar anger. This was the same rage that had driven him to pursue Operation Nightfall, even when his superiors had warned him to back off. The same fury that had made him dig deeper when evidence started disappearing, when witnesses began dying in convenient accidents, when it became clear that the conspiracy he'd uncovered reached into the highest levels of the DEA itself. That anger had cost him everything: his career, his freedom, his marriage. But it had also been the only honest thing in his life. The only reaction that made sense when confronted with institutional corruption so vast it defied comprehension. Now he felt that same anger stirring, awakened by the sound of federal agents' footsteps and the memory of Chapo's voice speaking words that suggested impossible knowledge. Some cages are built to hold specific birds. What if Chapo knew something about Operation Nightfall? What if the cartel leader's placement in this facility, in the cell next to a forgotten DEA agent, wasn't coincidence but design? What if someone wanted them in proximity for reasons that had nothing to do with available space or security protocols? Marcus pulled out the composition notebook and opened it to the page where he'd written his unsent letter to Elena. Her imagined face stared back at him from the words he'd never have the courage to mail. The woman who'd begged him to choose safety over truth, who'd walked away when she realized he couldn't stop being the man who asked dangerous questions. "I may have made a mistake last night." The words mocked him now, not because warning Chapo had been wrong, but because it might not have been enough. Because passive resistance, slipping warnings through prison networks, hoping others would handle the dirty work, was the action of a man who'd forgotten how to fight for what mattered. Marcus closed the notebook and shoved it back under his mattress. Through his narrow window, snow continued to fall on the Colorado mountains, the same pristine whiteness that had welcomed him to this concrete tomb 12 years ago. But now the snow looked different, not like purity, but like a blank canvas, waiting for someone to write truth across its surface in whatever ink was available, even if that ink was blood. Christmas was 3 days away, and Marcus could feel the weight of approaching decisions. He could retreat into invisibility and hope Benedetto's attention moved elsewhere. Or he could stop being Marcus Delgado, forgotten prisoner, and remember how to be Ghost, the agent who'd never learned to walk away from fights that mattered. The choice terrified him more than death itself. Marcus woke the next morning knowing that 12 years of carefully constructed invisibility had died in the night. The realization settled over him like the gray light filtering through his cell window, inevitable, irreversible, transformative. He'd crossed a line by warning Chapo, and there would be no walking back across it. The decision crystallized during the pre-dawn hours when sleep proved impossible. He'd spent those dark minutes staring at the concrete ceiling, listening to the mechanical breathing of the prison around him, understanding finally that his choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between existing and living, between surviving as Marcus Delgado, forgotten prisoner, and acting as Ghost, the agent who'd never learned when to quit. When his cell door clicked open for morning recreation, Marcus stepped into the corridor with the purposeful stride of a man who'd remembered his own name. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders squared instead of slouched, eyes alert instead of downcast, movements precise rather than shuffling. After 12 years of institutional camouflage, he was allowing himself to be seen. Rodriguez noticed immediately. The older man's scarred face registered surprise, then something approaching approval as he emerged from his own cell. "Morning, Ghost." The greeting carried new weight this time. an acknowledgement that the man Rodriguez had known was back from whatever grave he'd been hiding in. Morning. Marcus moved past the usual position for whispered conversations, walking instead toward the far end of the corridor, where Chapo's cell waited behind its steel door. The gesture was deliberate, visible to any cameras or guards who might be watching. He was declaring allegiance publicly, accepting whatever consequences came with that choice. Careful, Rodriguez murmured as he passed, but there was respect in his voice rather than concern. In a place where most men spent their sentences becoming smaller, watching someone choose to become larger commanded attention. Marcus stopped outside Chapo's door and spoke in a voice just loud enough to carry to nearby cells. "You breathing in there?" A moment of silence, then Chapo's voice emerged through the steel, better than expected, considering. "Though my breakfast conversation was more interesting than usual. The federal agents." Marcus understood the reference and knew that others listening would interpret it as confirmation that Chapo commanded resources beyond the prison walls. In the careful mathematics of institutional power, association with such influence carried value and danger. Good to hear. Marcus kept his response neutral, but didn't move away from the door. Let them see him talking to El Chapo. Let word spread through the prison networks that Ghost Delgado was picking sides. Christmas is still coming, so I'm told. There was dark amusement in Chapo's voice. I'm starting to believe it might be worth celebrating this year. The conversation was theater for their audience, but Marcus heard something underneath, a promise that the debt incurred by his warning would be repaid. In Chapo's world, favors were currency, and currency accumulated interest. Marcus was accepting an IOU from one of the most dangerous men in the world, written in blood and backed by resources that reached far beyond these concrete walls. Officer Martinez appeared at the end of the corridor, his expression darkening as he observed Marcus's position outside Chapo's cell. The guard's hand rested on his radio, ready to call for backup if necessary, treating the conversation as a potential incident rather than normal prisoner interaction. Marcus met Martinez's stare directly, another small act of rebellion against the institutional dynamics that had governed his existence for 12 years. Guards expected eye contact from troublemakers and predators, not from broken agents who'd learned to disappear into gray concrete. The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. "Problem here, Delgado?" Martinez's voice carried official authority, but Marcus detected uncertainty underneath. The guard had dealt with passive, invisible Marcus for years. This version was unfamiliar territory. "No problem." Marcus stepped away from Chapo's door but didn't retreat to his previous position of careful anonymity. Instead, he remained in the center of the corridor, visible, present, claiming space that he'd ceded long ago. Just checking on a neighbor. Martinez's eyes narrowed, recognizing the shift in dynamics but uncertain how to respond. In 12 years, Marcus had never caused incidents, never required discipline, never appeared on security reports. But authority in places like ADX Florence was built on predictability, and predictable men didn't suddenly change their patterns without reason. "Keep it moving," Martinez finally ordered, but his hand remained on his radio. As Marcus walked back toward his cell, he caught sight of other inmates watching from their doorways. Word would spread quickly. Ghost Delgado was awake, aligned with El Chapo, and no longer interested in invisibility. That information would reach Benedetto within hours, carried by the prison's invisible communication networks with the efficiency of digital transmission. The mob enforcer would have to respond. In a place where respect was the only protection, allowing defiance to stand unpunished was suicide. Marcus had essentially declared war by protecting Benedetto's target and then publicly associating with him. But as his cell door sealed him in for another day, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 12 years: purpose. The fear was still there, sharp and immediate, but underneath it burned the familiar fire that had driven him to pursue Operation Nightfall despite every warning. He was Ghost Delgado again, asking dangerous questions and refusing to accept comfortable lies. Christmas was 2 days away, and Marcus had chosen his side. The morning after his public declaration brought the first test of Marcus's newfound visibility. He was barely awake when the mechanical click of his cell door announced recreation time, but instead of the usual corridor murmur of inmates beginning their day, he heard only silence. Marcus stepped into the hallway and understood immediately. The corridor was empty except for 3 figures standing near the guard station. Tommy the Torch Benedetto, flanked by 2 inmates Marcus recognized as his enforcers. Vincent Caruso, a thin man with dead eyes who'd earned his reputation strangling rivals in New York back alleys. And James Tank Morrison, whose massive frame had crushed opposition for the Chicago outfit before federal racketeering charges landed him in Colorado. The message was unmistakable. Benedetto had orchestrated this encounter, using whatever influence he commanded to ensure privacy for their conversation. Other inmates remained locked in their cells, guards were mysteriously absent from their usual positions, and the security cameras that monitored every inch of ADX Florence seemed to have developed convenient blind spots. Ghost Delgado. Benedetto's voice carried the tone of a man accustomed to having his words treated as gospel. At 72, the mob enforcer still projected menace despite his slight frame and graying hair. "We need to talk." Marcus walked forward without hesitation, understanding that showing fear now would invite the kind of violence that left inmates in medical isolation for months. In the careful arithmetic of prison survival, weakness was permission for predators to strike. "I figured we might." Marcus stopped just outside comfortable striking distance, close enough to show respect but far enough to react if words became violence. "Here I am." Benedetto studied him with the calculating stare of a man who'd spent decades reading other men's souls before deciding whether they deserved to keep breathing. 12 years you've been invisible in this place, never caused problems, never made waves, never got involved in business that didn't concern you. Then suddenly you're playing guardian angel for a Mexican drug lord. Maybe I got tired of being invisible. Or maybe you got stupid. Caruso spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat affect of a natural killer. Stupid enough to interfere with family business. Marcus felt the familiar heat rising in his chest. The same anger that had driven him to pursue impossible cases when safer agents chose comfortable corruption. But now that anger was refined by 12 years of institutional education, tempered by understanding of exactly how violence worked in places like this. Family business. Marcus kept his voice level. "That what we're calling murder attempts now?" Benedetto raised a hand, silencing Caruso before the enforcer could respond. The gesture demonstrated the kind of absolute authority that made mob families function. Orders given without explanation, obedience expected without question. "You know what I think, Ghost?" Benedetto's tone remained conversational, despite the underlying threat. "I think you're confused about how things work here. This isn't the streets where DEA badges meant something. This is our world, and our world has rules. I'm listening. Rule 1. Stay in your lane. Rule 2. What happens to fish like Chapo isn't your concern. Rule 3. Interfering with family decisions has consequences." Benedetto paused, letting the words sink in. "You broke all 3 rules 2 nights ago." Marcus glanced at Tank Morrison, whose massive hands flexed unconsciously as he waited for orders. The man could crush skulls with those fingers, and his presence wasn't accidental decoration. Benedetto was demonstrating resources, showing Marcus exactly what kind of violence was available if diplomacy failed. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now you have a choice." Benedetto stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the man's aftershave. Somehow he'd managed to maintain grooming standards that transformed him from prisoner into visiting executive. "You can apologize for the misunderstanding, mind your own business going forward, and we forget this conversation ever happened. Or you can keep playing protector for your Mexican friend and learn why they call me the Torch." Benedetto's smile was winter cold. "Your choice, Ghost. But choose carefully. Some mistakes don't come with second chances." The corridor fell silent except for the mechanical hum of ventilation systems pushing stale air through concrete arteries. Marcus understood that this moment would define the rest of his sentence, perhaps the rest of his life. He could retreat into invisibility, accept Benedetto's authority, and spend his remaining years as Marcus Delgado, forgotten prisoner. Or he could remember why they'd once called him Ghost. Interesting offer. Marcus met Benedetto's stare directly. "But I think I'll pass." Caruso took a step forward, but Benedetto's raised hand stopped him again. The mob boss studied Marcus with new interest, recognizing something in the former agent's eyes that hadn't been there during 12 years of careful anonymity. "You sure about that, Ghost? Once I walk away, this conversation is over. No more negotiations." Marcus thought about Chapo's words, "Some cages are built to hold specific birds," about federal agents visiting on December 22nd, about 12 years of questions he'd stopped asking because the answers had cost him everything. "I'm sure." Benedetto nodded slowly, his expression shifting from diplomatic to predatory. "Christmas is tomorrow, Ghost. Enjoy it, because afterward we're going to teach you about consequences." The three men walked away with the unhurried confidence of predators who knew their prey couldn't escape. Marcus watched them disappear around the corner, listening to their footsteps fade into the mechanical hum of the prison's circulatory system. Only then did he allow himself to exhale, feeling the weight of what he'd just committed to settle over him like a shroud. Christmas was tomorrow. 24 hours to prepare for a war he couldn't win through conventional means. The corridor began filling with other inmates as cell doors clicked open in sequence. Marcus saw Rodriguez emerge first, the older man's scarred face registering immediate concern as he read the tension in Marcus's posture. Behind him came others, men who'd learned to interpret the subtle signs of institutional violence, who understood that empty corridors and delayed recreation schedules meant someone had just received a death sentence. "You look like a man who's seen his grave," Rodriguez murmured as he passed. "Maybe I have." Marcus fell into step beside him, both men walking toward the recreation area with the measured pace of those who'd learned that sudden movements attracted unwanted attention. "Question is whether I'm planning to lie down in it." Rodriguez glanced at him sharply. Benedetto made his position clear. Tomorrow's Christmas. Day after that, consequences. They reached the common area, a sterile space of concrete and steel where inmates gathered for their carefully rationed social time. Marcus chose a seat near the wall, positioning himself where he could watch all approaches while keeping his back protected. Rodriguez settled beside him, their conversation invisible among the dozen other whispered exchanges happening simultaneously. "You could still walk it back," Rodriguez said quietly. "Pride ain't worth dying for in here. Isn't it?" Marcus studied the older man's face, seeing decades of compromise etched in those scars. "What's the alternative? Spend the next 20 years knowing I bent the knee to a mob enforcer because I was too scared to stand up? You'd be alive to regret it." Through the reinforced windows, snow continued to fall on the Colorado landscape. Marcus found himself thinking about Christmases before his arrest, Elena stringing lights on their apartment balcony, the smell of her grandmother's tamales filling their kitchen, the way she'd insisted on midnight mass even though neither of them was particularly religious. She'd believed in redemption through ritual, in the possibility that old mistakes could be washed clean by new beginnings. Now he wondered if redemption was something you earned or something you seized, whether waiting for forgiveness was just another form of cowardice. "Rodriguez," Marcus kept his voice low, "how well do you know Chapo's reputation from the outside?" The older man's expression grew cautious. "Well enough to know he didn't build an empire by being merciful to his enemies. But he pays his debts with interest. Why?" Marcus weighed his words carefully. In ADX Florence, information was currency, and currency bought survival. But the wrong information, shared with the wrong person, could buy death just as easily. "Because I think I'm about to find out if he remembers favors." Before Rodriguez could respond, a new voice cut through their conversation. Delgado. Officer Martinez approached their table, his expression carrying the bureaucratic authority of a man delivering official orders. "Warden wants to see you." Marcus felt the familiar chill of institutional summons. In 12 years, he'd been called to the warden's office exactly 3 times, once during intake processing, once when his appeal was denied, and once when Elena had filed for divorce. None of those conversations had improved his situation. Now. As Marcus stood, Rodriguez caught his arm. "Whatever they offer you, remember, some deals cost more than they're worth." The walk to the administrative wing felt like a funeral procession. Martinez maintained professional silence, but Marcus detected something in the guard's demeanor. Not the casual authority he'd shown earlier, but the careful neutrality of a man handling volatile materials. They passed through 3 security checkpoints, each one sealing behind them with mechanical finality, until Marcus found himself in a corridor he'd forgotten existed. Carpeted floors, painted walls, the kind of institutional comfort reserved for staff and official visitors. The warden's office occupied a corner of the administrative building with windows that offered an unobstructed view of the mountains. Warden Patricia Sullivan sat behind a mahogany desk that had probably cost more than most inmates' annual commissary allowances, her gray hair pulled back in a style that projected competence without warmth. "Mr. Delgado." She gestured to a chair facing her desk. "Thank you for coming," as if he'd had a choice. Marcus took the offered seat, noting that Martinez remained in the doorway, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to provide the illusion of privacy. "Warden." Sullivan opened a thick file on her desk. His file, Marcus realized, recognizing his own mugshot clipped to the inside cover. 12 years of behavior reports, medical records, psychological evaluations, and disciplinary actions. The paper trail of his institutional existence. "We need to discuss your recent activities," she said, "and your future here." Marcus studied the warden's face, searching for tells that might reveal the true purpose of this meeting. In 12 years of exemplary behavior, he'd earned exactly 3 disciplinary infractions, all minor, all quickly resolved. Now Sullivan was treating him like a problem that required management. "My recent activities," Marcus repeated carefully. "You mean talking to my cellmate?" "I mean developing relationships that concern my security staff." Sullivan turned a page in his file, her finger tracing lines of text that Marcus couldn't read upside down. "Mr. Guzman has been here less than a week, but already we're seeing changes in established patterns." The careful language told Marcus everything. They were monitoring him, his conversations, his movements, his associations. The question was whether this surveillance represented routine institutional paranoia or something more targeted. Changes like what? Like a model prisoner suddenly positioning himself as a protector for the most notorious cartel leader in American custody. Sullivan's tone remained professionally neutral, but Marcus caught the steel underneath. Like 12 years of invisible behavior replaced overnight by public displays of alliance. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. They knew about his warning to Chapo, about his confrontation with Benedetto. The realization brought a familiar taste of copper and adrenaline, the same sensation he'd experienced during deep undercover operations when his cover identity began to crack. "Warden, if there's something specific you want to discuss." Agent Delgado. The title hit him like a physical blow. For 12 years, he'd been inmate 47,291 to 019, a number in the federal system. Hearing his former rank spoken aloud in this sterile office felt like resurrection and violation simultaneously. "Let's speak honestly about why you're really here." The room seemed to contract around him. Martinez shifted position in the doorway, and Marcus realized the guard's hand now rested casually on his weapon. Whatever was about to happen, they'd prepared for resistance. "I'm here because I was convicted of crimes that were classified above your security clearance." Sullivan closed his file with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. "Of operations that officially never existed, conducted by agencies that have no public record of your employment." Marcus's mouth went dry. The official story, the one that had appeared in newspapers and court documents, portrayed him as a rogue DEA agent who'd crossed lines in pursuit of a drug cartel. The real story, the one buried under layers of national security classifications, was something else entirely. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Sullivan leaned forward, her gray eyes sharp with predatory intelligence. "You weren't sent here to serve time, Agent Delgado. You were sent here to disappear. There's a difference." The words hit him like ice water, washing away 12 years of carefully constructed acceptance. Marcus had always known his case involved more than simple corruption, but he'd convinced himself that the truth didn't matter anymore, that justice had been served, even if the public version was incomplete. Now, sitting in this office while snow fell on Colorado mountains, he understood that he'd been naive. Men weren't buried alive in places like ADX Florence for crossing ethical lines in drug investigations. They were buried for discovering things that powerful people needed to stay hidden. And now you're making waves, Sullivan continued, drawing attention to yourself at precisely the moment when attention is the last thing anyone wants. Anyone meaning who? Sullivan's smile was winter cold. The same people who've been paying for your comfortable accommodations here for the past 12 years. The same people who could make those accommodations considerably less comfortable if you continued down your current path. The threat was elegant in its simplicity. Marcus wasn't just a forgotten prisoner. He was an asset being maintained by forces that operated in the shadows between legitimate government and criminal enterprise. His protection, his safety, even his life depended on continuing to be the invisible, broken man they'd created. But Chapo's arrival had changed the equation. Whatever the cartel leader knew about Marcus's real crimes threatened to expose connections that reached far beyond federal drug enforcement. And exposure meant elimination. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to remember who you really are. Sullivan stood, moving to the window that overlooked the mountains. You're not Ghost Delgado anymore. You're not a federal agent seeking justice. You're inmate 47,291-019, serving life without parole for crimes against the United States government. Marcus felt something fracture inside his chest. 12 years of careful psychological construction crumbling like old concrete. The fear he'd been holding at bay since Chapo's arrival now roared through him with the force of a flash flood. Not fear of death, which would have been simple, but fear of the truth. Fear that everything he'd believed about his imprisonment, his crimes, his purpose, was a lie constructed to keep him compliant while more dangerous truths remained buried. And if I refused to remember? Sullivan turned from the window, her expression carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Then we'll help you remember, starting tonight. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus sat frozen in the warden's chair, watching Sullivan's reflection in the window glass. A gray specter overlaying the snow-covered mountains beyond. The comfortable fiction he'd maintained for 12 years crumbled around him like old mortar, revealing the stark architecture of his true situation. Tonight, he repeated, his voice sounding foreign in his own ears. Sullivan returned to her desk with the measured pace of an executioner. Transfer orders are already being processed. Administrative segregation, pending investigation into security violations, standard protocol for inmates who pose potential risks to institutional safety. The whole. Solitary confinement in a concrete box barely large enough for a man to lie down, where the only human contact came through a food slot and the only light filtered through a narrow window designed to prevent suicide attempts. Marcus had seen men emerge from extended stays in the hole as hollow-eyed shells, their minds fractured by weeks or months of sensory deprivation. How long? That depends entirely on your attitude adjustment. Sullivan opened a different file, this one significantly thinner. Mr. Guzman has also been experiencing some difficulties with institutional adjustment. It seems he's been spreading false information about other inmates, creating security concerns that require immediate intervention. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. While Marcus was being buried alive in solitary, Chapo would be isolated as well, separated from any protection Marcus might provide, vulnerable to whatever Benedetto and his associates had planned. The timing wasn't coincidental. Christmas Day would find both men locked away from witnesses, their cells accessible only to guards who could be bought, transferred, or simply ordered to look the other way. You're going to let them kill him. I'm going to maintain order in my facility. Sullivan's tone carried the practiced neutrality of someone who justified countless compromises. What happens between inmates during administrative processing isn't my responsibility. Marcus felt the walls closing in, not just the physical walls of the warden's office, but the invisible barriers that had defined his existence since his arrest. For 12 years he'd accepted his cage because he'd believed in the system that had put him there. Even corrupted, even compromised, it was still justice of a sort. Now he understood that justice had never been part of the equation. He wasn't a prisoner serving time for crimes against society. He was a loose end, being managed by people who operated beyond any law he'd once sworn to uphold. "The operation in Juarez," he said quietly. "That's what this is really about." Sullivan's expression didn't change, but Martinez shifted position in the doorway. The name meant something to them, enough to warrant increased vigilance. Ancient history, Agent Delgado, better left buried. But Marcus was already remembering despite 12 years of enforced amnesia. Fragments of classified briefings, satellite imagery of compounds that didn't appear on any map, meetings with officials whose names he'd been ordered to forget. Operation Crossroads, a joint task force investigation into cartel money laundering that had uncovered something far more dangerous than drug trafficking. They'd found evidence of a shadow network that moved more than narcotics across borders. Government officials, corporate executives, intelligence assets, all connected by financial flows that originated in cartel territory but terminated in places that should have been beyond criminal reach. When Marcus had tried to pursue those connections, he'd been pulled off the operation. When he'd continued investigating on his own, he'd been arrested. "Chapo knows," Marcus said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "That's why you can't let him talk to anyone. He was there. He saw the same things I saw. Mr. Guzman is a convicted terrorist and drug trafficker whose word would never be accepted in any legitimate forum." But Sullivan's voice carried a tension that hadn't been there before, even if anyone were foolish enough to listen to him. The truth was worse than Marcus had imagined. They weren't just managing him, they were managing an entire network of inconvenient witnesses, keeping them isolated and discredited while the real criminals continued operating with government protection. Chapo's arrival at ADX Florence hadn't been random prison assignment, it had been strategic placement, putting him in a facility where his knowledge could be contained permanently. "How many others?" Marcus asked. "How many inmates here are really just witnesses being managed?" Sullivan closed the file and stood, signaling the end of their conversation. "Officer Martinez will escort you to your new accommodations. You'll have time to reflect on the wisdom of pursuing dangerous knowledge." As Martinez stepped forward, Marcus felt something break inside his chest. Not the gradual erosion of hope he'd experienced during his trial, but a sudden, catastrophic failure of the psychological structures he'd built to survive his imprisonment. For 12 years, he'd maintained his sanity by believing that his sacrifice had meaning, that justice existed even when it was imperfect. Now he understood that he'd been a fool. There was no justice, no meaning, no purpose beyond the convenience of powerful men who traded in secrets and blood. Everything he'd believed about his country, his career, his principles was a lie constructed to keep him compliant, while more dangerous truths remained buried. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with mechanical precision, sealing his fate,